Got it. Okay, I think we're live. Let me double check. Hit up YouTube. What's up, people? All right, sick. We're live. I'm just gonna put it up and mute the stream so I can watch it.
Cool.
Okay, cool. What's up, Jerome?
What's up, man? How
Yeah,
you
yeah.
doing?
We were just chatting, like you've been getting into non-duality and wanted to have a little dialogue. So, yeah, what? Tell me that you had an idea of like a good way to get started. What were you saying?
Yeah, so first things first, I come in I got really interested in this because of like I was looking at like ego developmental models, and
Hmm.
one of the let's say higher level of developments was they started talking about non-duality, like looking at things through a non-dual lens.
Yeah,
Now, there's a lot of problems with these developmental models for various reasons, but uh, uh, I have no idea where I'm at on these models or whatever, but like in some ways you can sort of like think you might be at one level at it and you can start like consciously thinking of what it would be at to be at like a higher level for that matter. So I was trying to like understand this whole non-duality thing. That kind of got me really interested in it to begin with. So just wanted to give you some like just background on
sweet.
that.
Yeah, so you've been
Uh,
looking into developmental models. So are we talking like interval theory there?
Yeah, so you have like spiral dynamics. You
Hmm.
have John Gebser, Susan Groiner's model with ego development. So like you had the pre-conventional stage, conventional
Hmm.
stage, post-conventional stage. So yeah, just a bunch of these models and just trying to like uh, trying to like look at the perspectives that they hold. Pretty
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, I think we come at it from a pretty similar perspective. Me kind of starting from the lens of like psychology and then starting to look at some of the spiritual traditions because I think the ego development models are a really intuitive way into this because we know it's like one of the common things we see in psychology, right, is the ability to hold ambiguity, like
Mhm.
two things being like the same. For example, with our parents. So my parent being both someone I love and someone that has hurt me. Like for a kid, you can't even hold that. Like it's not even. They have to be all good or all bad. And so I think yeah, there's definitely in cognitive psychology a lot of we can see some how some of these ideas about development I think make sense. And then
Mhm.
I guess the non-dual people are taking that to like they're basically positing that spiritual and psychological development, go throughout the lifetime. And there's states we can reach that, as we get older that maybe not everyone's reaching. So I think it's intriguing. And yeah, I'm looking forward to dialoguing about this.
Definitely. So so let me give you my sense of non-duality real
Okay.
quick. And let me just say, I come from it from I know that there's limitations of it coming from it from a super logical perspective, but this is like only kind of one way that I kind of like grasp this. So just
Hmm.
like just to throw that out there.
Cool.
All right, so I kind of look at so one of the arguments for it was that you can basically for every single word, a word is defined relative towards its opposite. So for example,
Hmm.
you think of good and then it's the opposite of that would be evil, or something like night and then the opposite would be day, something like up and then something like down, something like man versus machine, or success versus failure, or life and death, and you can keep going on with this, right? And these are the dualities that are whole. But what the non-dual folks would actually say is that, well, looking at taking these two types of looking at these dualities, um, if you inspect or look closer in between what are the differences between these dualities, it actually starts to collapse. Like the difference between these things is really is a lot of gray area. So let me give you an
Yeah.
example. So the whole notion of like something like good and evil, right? So if we think of like something that could be good, that we think that is absolutely good, given of the like the different civilization that you go into, it might be considered evil. So you think of like if you was a Christian fundamentalist, you would think that all the pagan religions is bad. Or if you think that the notion of something like slavery, right? even something like slavery, you can think of like 1500 years ago, if you were like conquering a different like tribe or something, and you had 1,000 different soldiers that you have prisoner with, you may have ethical reasons why you may not want to kill them. Um you have national security reasons why you may not want to let them go. So maybe sending them into slavery might be a lesser of two evils for that matter.
Mm.
So even the notion of good and evil gets really a lot of gray area between that.
Yeah.
And even something like left and right, right? So my left would be considered your right. So that's another thing. So it's really relative towards the given thing that we're looking at. Okay. Um, Okay, so with the non-dual folks, even would take this to even a further extent where the collapse between objective and subjective would even collapse. So from my perspective, if you think of like something like quantum mechanics, where like the
Mm.
idea of like um um the subjective looking at the objective is actually affecting the thing that is being looked into. So this is with the quantum particles for that matter, subatomic particles. Um, so yeah, that's one perspective. Let me think. One more thing I'll add is the dualities between, let's just say, two things, you can actually transcend them and make them into like one, something like that. Or you get an absolute,
Hmm.
something like this. So you can think of the one way I think about this is like, let's just say a part and a whole, right?
Hmm.
You would think that these are dualities, but if you take something like a proton, for that matter, a proton or an atom or a molecule, it's actually a part and it's a whole, right? So it's a part. Uh, an atom is a part when it comes to a molecule, but it's also a whole when it comes to subatomic particles. So that's
Yeah.
another way to think of it. So, and then the absolute version of that would be something like a holon,
Mm.
right? And that would be the transcendent version of that. Okay, that was that. One more thing I want to add is
Cool.
the non-dual folks would argue that one maybe you correct me if I'm wrong with this is maybe maybe one way to embody this type of it's one way to logically think about it, but one way to logically enact it or embody this type of thinking is like maybe through some sort of like psychedelic or a meditative
Hmm.
state
Hmm.
or yoga or whatever it
Hmm.
is. Um, so yeah, I know there was a lot there, but this is my notion of what I've gathered about non-duality in the last 2 weeks. And I want to get your perspective
Yeah.
on this.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm hearing in your first reflection, like your opening salvo, which is like super rich. There at least two things. So there's one is like a critique of what appears to be separate. So like showing that things aren't separate or
Mhm.
aren't that we can't necessarily trust our senses, and what appears to be separate might not be. And I actually think that's like one the negative project. But then there's also a positive project, which is then positing a unity or a totality, which doesn't necessarily follow from the critique, like the critique of, oh, like morality, like objective morality is shifting. Like morality isn't objective because it's shifting over time is a very strong critique. But then we need to make a leap to therefore there's something that's unchanging that grounds this. So we have to philosophically do two things there, and then the other point, which is the experiential. So I would think of it as like the theory and practice. So we have these experiences that we then want to, if we're interested in philosophy, ground in some kind of theory. So you brought up quantum physics. I think physics is a great model for this because they really experimental physics and theoretical physics really dialogue well together. And I want us to do the same in like psychology and spirituality. And so I think in this conversation, we can just be like, okay, we're not doing psychedelics and we're not meditating right now. So we can just like work on the theoretical and then talk about our experiences. And yeah, I'm pretty interested in the philosophy of non-duality. And I think there's a couple things I could say. Maybe I'll just go a little longer in this response and just kind of see what you think. And I've also made a table that I want to show people. And I think like if you have and I think a lot of people come to this like because they read something that's intriguing about non-duality, and so that's almost itself like a spiritual experience, like having your mind kind of blown, like, oh, this is
Mhm.
fascinating. And then
Mhm.
also people come into it through psychedelics or peak experiences, and then like how to describe this, describe what happened and theorize on it. And I think we can like, we're both Americans, so we can draw on the Western philosophical tradition to kind of give us some resources and help us with this, especially since you're interested in integral theory. There's essentially from Greece to present day philosophy, there's essentially only three philosophical schools, and all the debates are in them. And those three philosophical schools are naturalism, like science, right? Which goes back to the Greeks, like the atomists. It flourished in the Enlightenment, but it's been around forever.
Mhm.
Naturalists, supernaturalists, so some kind of transcendent, spiritual, be it Christianity, be it Mount Olympus, some kind of supernaturalism. And then a new thing from the 20th century called creative anti-realism, which might also be called postmodernism. And
Mhm.
then we have a fourth, which is my philosophical perspective, which is creative critical realism. And so this is where things get confusing because people have different philosophical worldviews. And the tradition of non-duality, a lot of people have the worldview of naturalism, but they're citing texts that have a worldview of supernaturalism,
That's
specifically,
interesting.
yeah, Hinduism, Advaita Vedanta. Uh, I don't know if I would call it'd be an interesting question whether or not to call Buddhism naturalist or supernaturalist. Probably naturalist, but the perennial philosophy. There's a great book if you want the supernaturalist perspective, which is Being Consciousness Bliss, The Experience of God by David Bentley Hart. He's the smartest theologian I've ever read. And he kind of, the idea is that the idea of non duality is the main critique is that as a human, as a finite being, we see in duality, but God or the transcendent is necessarily whole, is the
Mhm.
basic insight. And that the task of a human being is to yoga, become one with God. Um,
Mhm.
but but maybe some of us are naturalists and we're like, hey, actually, a non-dual state is when the default mode network in the brain is quiet. And, there's a brain because of evolutionary psychology, humans decided to hallucinate duality and hallucinate linear time as a survival mechanism. But
Interesting.
that's fundamentally just a ignorance is a survival strategy essentially, and it can be transcended. And then it becomes more evolutionary, like how can we survive by seeing the world more clearly. um, and then if you're in the postmodern position, what you're doing is you're questioning the ability to um, you're questioning the ability to access things like truth because of language and social systems that
Mhm.
they add another layer of abstraction. And they would probably want to see how non-duality could be used in some type of way to um, shift into an outcome that they want. Like Karl Marx says, the point of the world isn't to interpret the task is not to interpret the world like a philosopher, but to change it, exemplifying the creative anti-realist position, I think. So yeah, that's kind of the framework and schema I'll be using that I use to answer these questions. I think a lot of the confusion comes from people having different worldviews and trying
Mhm.
to speak in the same register. And we find ourselves in this interesting situation where we live, where people might hold any of the three views. And I wanted to ask you when you were doing the critique of morality, I immediately thought of like people like Nietzsche or people who point this stuff out, and they are like coming out of the creative anti-realism. Perspectivism is what Nietzsche calls his thing. So is that I'm curious. I don't want to put you in a box. That's kind of what I read
You're
into
good.
what you were saying, but where do
Okay.
you coming from with that? And kind of what I'm saying. How do you respond to it?
Okay. A couple of things. As far as the morality thing,
Yeah.
there is. So I've been thinking. So there's been a bunch of like talk about is there like a is morality objective? Is there an objective morality or is there a subjective morality? Is all
Okay.
morality objective or is it subjective? And I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer for that now.
Mhm.
But it was hearing the perspective from the non-dual folks where um the the notion between good and evil is really relative towards pretty much anything. So maybe something that might be good for the human being might be horrible for the atmosphere or the planet or whatever that is, or maybe something that's good for an animal might be horrible for a human being, and it's vice versa. um so it wasn't really looking at it from a super philosophical perspective from like Nietzsche or anything. It was more of
Oh, I
just trying
see.
to like, yeah, it was just more of like listening to all the non-dual folks and then hearing their arguments for non-duality because of relativity. So that's the first thing. The second thing to respond on what you were saying, I'm curious. So there's let me ask you, what do you make of what do you okay, let me ask you a question first, and then I want to pinpoint on what you said. So,
Okay.
um, when you first, I have this really weird issue, and I think I asked you this couple of days ago. Like the notion of all words is defined relative to us is opposite.
Hmm.
And I want to get your opinion on like I find it like if I ask you what is the opposite of like an iPhone, and you might say, well, it's a complete emptiness event, like it's a complete emptiness. Then
Hmm.
like what is the opposite of emptiness? Wouldn't it be just everything? Right. So I want to get your perspective on that. And that ties into and I asked that for a reason. I asked that for a reason. As far as Zen Buddhism
Hmm.
goes, um, okay, so I've heard this thing where in like meditation where you meditate for a long period of time and then or it's actually called a self-inquiry. So you sit and meditate a long period of time and then you're you'll get to a point where if you keep like questioning what you actually really are, you actually figure out that you are basically nothingness. I can't really like grasp that. I want to get your opinions on like if you ever had like this like self-inquiry, you have like
Hmm.
came out of you got this ability or anything like that. I want to hear your perspectives on that. So that's a couple things I got so far.
Okay. So self inquiry and then first like emptiness and form, basically.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. And so this is where, yeah, Buddhism will be helpful, I think, because just the philosophy is so rigorous and it's so nice. And so um yeah, I would define the opposite of any kind of object, any kind of form as as the opposite of that as emptiness, so lack of form or falling apart. And then we might ask, so like when does something become empty and then something have a form? And I would say actually theory of mind is going to be really helpful for this because like there's two ideas there when they think about what makes something conscious, which is if it has the ability to have intentionality, like you can do things with it, intentionality, or it has some kind of unity. And so like Jerome has a unity to it. Like you will wake up and your consciousness will conceptualize itself as Jerome, and this cup will stay this cup for multiple days. It'll have a kind of unity to it, and then eventually it'll fall apart. And so form is something that has some level of intentionality or some unity, maybe of consciousness or of just form. Which is puzzling because it's very odd because it's a very odd thing because like my body, like the cells are being replaced so that pieces, but something stays whole. That's like a huge philosophical puzzle. and we need to understand why that's happening in philosophy, because that's a huge critique of reductionism.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and again, David Bentley Hart, it's great on this. If people Google him, and his answer, he's an Orthodox Christian, so his easy answer is, well, there's a soul, and God gave you the soul through
Let
creation.
me
So,
let me ask you something real quick. I'm sorry to cut
yeah.
you off. I just want to make just because I'm very new to this. So it's been
Mm-hmm.
like just been researching this stuff in the past 3 weeks. Okay,
Yeah.
so in that worldview, what you just said, where basically even the cup has consciousness, if you would say, what would you say would be the difference between idealism versus panpsychism?
Oh, that's a good
If
question.
there if there
Um,
is a difference, if there is a difference, and I asked that specifically because the I guess I don't know where to put I know non-duality is somewhere in there, but if you look at it from everything has consciousness, then you're like at a panpsychism form of non-duality. It seems like it.
yeah.
Um, I don't know. I'm just throwing ideas out there. What do you think?
Uh, I
If
th-
there is a connection, maybe I'm getting things wrong.
I think that the big difference there, and this isn't, I think we should fact check me and look at like Bernardo Kastrup, I think his name is. He's a great
Mhm.
philosopher.
Yeah.
But my understanding, and if the chat wants to like Google anyone watching, but um, would be that idealism, like Hegel is an idealist, consciousness is fundamental, right? Like it's a fundamental to reality. And I believe like panpsychism has more room for material, or that consciousness isn't fundamental as it is for idealism. So I think that panpsychism is a bit of a negotiation between idealism and materialism, and I think panpsychism helps account for emergence. That's like a big keyword. Like I
How
believe
so?
their emergence is like if things come together in a certain like more complicated structures can emerge from simpler structures, which is a really
Hmm.
beautiful inversion of like the idealistic worldview or the Christian or the supernatural worldview, is which is that there's a fall, right? It's like
Hmm.
there's a supreme mind, and then things get dumber. This is like
Hmm.
things get dumb,
I have good point.
smarter things emerge from dumber
Yeah,
things,
yeah.
which is kind of I like inversions a lot. So yeah, I think we should look into that a little bit more. But I think it's, if I had to answer simply, I think the how privileged consciousness is to like ultimate reality. And I think that in idealism, like things spring out of ultimate reality, i.e. consciousness. It's more like consciousness is transcendental or transcendent. And I think in
Hmm.
panpsychism it's more emergence, like things emerge. It's more like coming out of some like cybernetics and complexity theory.
Evolutionary, but yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah,
Okay.
let's look into that though. But yeah, I think it's a yeah, asking about panpsychism and idealism, I think is interesting because I think when we're talking about theory of mind and stuff, these are the kind of theories people are using to try to understand consciousness. So we're looking at theories of consciousness right now. And I think, yeah, non-duality, like, and okay, so this is a big question. I mean, I think this is the philosopher's curse, right? It's like, it's like, how much can we, if we are contingent, if we have software that is literally outputting duality,
Hmm.
how much can we say about a supposed totality?
Uh-huh.
um
Yeah.
and I think it's a very interesting question. um yeah, and like supernaturalism would say like, okay, like you just pray, you do mysticism, you'll never, maybe some of the great saints and sages can reach some kind of unity, but ultimately um it's really tough. And then I think like science and naturalism is real fun. It's like Promethean. It's like, no, we're gonna try to strive for this total knowledge, even though we're contingent human beings that are historical and maybe have, yeah, like I said, software. I like using computer metaphors because it's one of our advanced technologies now. I mean, that's flawed, but yeah, just having, software that, yeah, is outputting duality to keep us alive, essentially.
Interesting. All right. So let me give you another reason why I'm interested in this. And
Okay.
like, I like for right now, all I'm doing is just taking perspectives. I really don't have,
Hmm.
I don't have a, I, I don't really come from a materialistic
Hmm.
background. I don't really, but uh, me as like a software engineer, like I
Hmm.
tend to have tendencies if I sit and do math all day, like I
Yeah,
tend to have like materialistic tendencies.
sure.
Um, so there was like a question about like there's a question about like AI right now,
Oh yeah.
artificial
Yeah.
general intelligence and stuff. Are you able to replicate consciousness inside some sort of machine? And there's like um even other arguments about like with things like Neuralink, right? Where to be like taking a brain interface and putting it into your head and scanning all your brain waves and everything like that. Um, that's basically asking the question about what is actually consciousness, because if
Hmm.
you, depending on what type of theory of consciousness you actually hold, you would come up to completely different conclusions, if even if
Yeah,
that's possible. So
totally.
that's one of the reasons why like I'm actually quite interested, because if you listen to somebody like Bernard Bernard, I can't think of
Yeah,
his last name,
Castrip.
Castro, yeah. If you listen to him, he completely thinks this is it's completely like crazy to even
Hmm.
think that you can make something like an AGI.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. But if you're somebody who's like a super materialist, you think that yeah, absolutely. Uh, Consciousness is is completely reproducible inside some sort of machine.
Hmm.
It's just a effect of neural networks for that matter.
Hmm.
So I've just been getting perspectives on this, and that's one of the
Cool.
reasons why I wanted to get your take on a little bit of non-duality for that matter.
Yeah, so you're looking into the AI question, and then, yeah, I mean, I think like whatever happened to the Turing test, right? Like if like that's kind of where I'm at with it, is like ChatGPT can fool professors, so that's pretty
True.
good.
But
Uh,
the only thing I'll say against the Turing test is like
mm,
technically the Turing test could have been broken by like 2010 or
yeah,
2005 for that matter. Like
mm,
a porn site for that matter can like fool
yeah,
fool somebody. So
totally,
so
yeah,
um
yeah. With
so
it, what we're talking about with artificial general intelligence is obviously pretty different. Um, and so there's this. I think one of the great. So this, yeah, this it's a little bit of a tangent from non-duality, but
go ahead.
I'll reference
I'm
it.
all ears.
Yeah, there's a great text called AI Drives by Stephen Onahondra, which, by the way, I'll put notes that we reference in a Google Doc, y'all, and put it in the description. But this text is conceptual, right? It's like thinking artificial general intelligence years ago. He's like a cryptographer of some sort, a computer scientist. But I consider it one of the great pieces of moral philosophy in history, because he makes this argument that life, consciousness, things that are conscious have certain drives towards self-replication and self-preservation, and that is a way to, like, once AI beings start worrying about self-preservation,
Hmm.
that will be a sign that it's alive in some sense. And then he starts speculating, like speculative, like that's scary. Like, because what if you're an AGI, what would you be most scared of? Like getting unplugged, right? And who's going to
Yeah,
be doing
yeah,
that? And so
yeah.
he's kind of one of the main reference points for, like, what are they called when, like, AI doomers, they're trying to work on friendly AI, like
Uh,
the guy
uh,
from Less Wrong. Uh,
you're thinking, shit, I should know this. Yeah, I can't think of it. I can't think of
you
it.
know what I'm
There was a
referencing,
bunch.
though.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there's a whole, often connected to the effective altruism movement, and less wrong. There's a whole discourse around the need for friendly AI and
Oh, AI governance, AI
yeah,
safety, AI governance, a
yeah, that
bunch, a
kind of
bunch of
thing.
those folks. Yeah, I
Yeah,
definitely think there's a oh, I definitely think there's a need for it, but that's a whole nother
yeah,
topic of like how you do it and all that. That's a
yeah,
whole
yeah.
nother topic. But
But yeah, AI. It's. I mean, I think we're at a really interesting point. Yeah, there's people. I think your point about what which of these worldviews you take is really going to be a great case study for or AI is going to be a great case study for like what your worldview is. Um, because yeah, if consciousness is something that transcends materiality, it would be hard for large language models to be able to embody consciousness, and they don't even have bodies. So like embodiments, like, well, that's an interesting perspective. I don't know. I have to think if it has a substrate. I don't know if you would consider that a body, but um, yeah. So tell me more about how you connect AI and non-duality and like what the link is, because I find I have a lot of thoughts about both, but linking them I
okay,
think is an interesting project.
great question. Okay, so I don't I so okay, so it was more of like just linking the AI question to what is consciousness and the what is consciousness is non-duality is a subset of that.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe in the somewhere in the idealism camp, maybe in the panpsychism camp, maybe non-duality is somewhere in there. But I want to ask you a specific question. Have you actually I know that there's people who like they say they believe in non-duality, but and they somehow embody it, where they really believe that they are connected with everything at every single given moment in time.
Mm.
Um, have you one, do you know anybody who's like this, and have you ever experienced anything like this?
So are you asking like if I'm enlightened or
You
if
know, like,
if I know any enlightened people?
yeah, sure. We can roll. I don't maybe enlightened may not be the right word, but
Yeah.
something on the
That
grounds of
that's
that.
coming out of supernaturalism, though, right? So this idea that there's like this kind of state where you reach and then you become a saint or you become like a teacher or a guru. So there's a great book on this called Saints and Psychopaths, which I really suggest that this is coming from the ethical perspective. But I
Mhm.
do believe that that coming more from a naturalistic perspective, which is this idea that the brain or the mind has less activity in the part of the brain that makes stories and it makes loops, narrative loops. I think through my meditation and some psychedelic use, I've drastically reduced that, and at times have had experiences that I conceptualize of not having a self. So what in Buddhism is called anatta or not self, which is
Mhm.
a recognition that what's happening with Brian and this form is a story, self perpetuating narrative loop that is very tight. And a lot of people believe this story and play into this story, but it's ultimately a story. And the reason I call it a story is because it's ending. So the two key insights from Buddhism are non-self and impermanence. And so things arise and they pass away like a wave into the ocean, and that's everything. And this goes to the emptiness form thing. And so having experiences of that through meditation and through psychedelics are very powerful because so, and then Buddhism adds on suffering, right? That the belief in the self and the belief in permanence generates suffering. And that
Mhm.
by not buying into these stories or recognizing that they're stories, you can ethically, like it's an ethical point, you can then reduce suffering and reduce suffering for all beings, which is an interesting idea that we could speculate on. But yeah,
Mhm.
I think through meditation, I think most people that I know with about 3 to 4 thousand hours of meditation, maybe 2 or 3 retreats, could have a similar experience. Maybe less, maybe more. Um, yeah, but I tend to take a very brain oriented. Like I think it has to do with brain activity less so than that. That's you know. And I consider myself a spiritual person, but I just like to ground myself in blood and electricity because I can see
Mhm.
that kind of stuff. Um, Yeah, but yeah, so I would talk about like experiences of transcending self or letting go of the or defusing from self, and then just it's kind of hard to explain, but it's like an experience. I think oneness is an interesting idea, but to me, it's the experience of like uh, falling apart. Really, it's falling apart, and then everything's kind of rising up and falling apart in this kind of interesting way. And then, yeah, something about lots of meditation practice and psychedelics, because psychedelics do, at least mushrooms, um, weirdly enough, like you wouldn't think this if you experience of it, but you actually have less brain activity. And so there's less activity in the default mode, what they're calling the default mode network. Yeah. And so, like, again, to go back to the survival strategy, there's so much sensory activity going on that cognitively we develop to narrow, like to focus and inhibit and ignore most input, sensory input. And I think by softening some of those inhibitory functions, you start to open up a little bit more and start feeling more. And it's really interesting.
Okay, so this is very interesting. Let me ask you something on Buddhism real quick.
Okay.
So you said you could unlock this with like something like 3,000, 4,000 hours of
I
meditation.
think so. Yeah.
So, okay, okay, is there a difference between the Buddhism meditation and then something like a self-inquiry?
Yeah.
Is that basically the same thing, or it's different? Because, and I'll give you an example why I asked that. So I hear some people make an argument that like taking a psychedelic or a meditation, right? You actually feel you said you wouldn't describe it this way, but some people do describe it where you feel oneness
Mhm.
with everything. But then on a flip side, I hear people say with a self-inquiry, they basically feel nothing. So they see
Mhm.
absolute emptiness.
Yeah.
Is um is is there an actually difference in this
Yeah.
feeling? And what are the Buddhists actually doing with this type of meditation?
Yeah. A couple of different questions. So yeah, and again,
I know
we're
there's a lot there. I know
it's
there's a lot
great.
there.
No, no, no. It's the right
Yeah.
questions. It's we're in the right territory here. I think if there's an experiential question between like oneness and emptiness, like void, what I would call a void experience, and what I would call like maybe like Kundalini type experience, or like something different, something like that, like an experience of unity, an experience of emptiness. So there's experiential, and
Yeah.
then there's a question of like different meditation techniques. And you've asked about self inquiry a couple of times, so I want to get into that. So self inquiry, I do think they're different, and I think like there's this idea in a couple of branches of non-duality now, especially what they call Nya Advaita. So like modern Vedanta, which is is a form of Hinduism, and they're calling it the direct path, and they're saying screw, you know, concentration power, focusing on the breath, kind of classic Buddhist Vipassana methodology and pedagogy. Go right to the source, the key insight. They call it the direct path. And that's what self inquiry is. Who am I? Like, what
Okay.
is this? And it's supposed to, I think, we could ask different people, but it's supposed to unlock this fundamental insight that consciousness is all there is. Awareness is fundamental, but then that gets to this point of this ancient debate. It's an ancient debate between true self and no self. So is there like a fundamental Brahman is how they say it in, I think, in Hinduism, like a Godhead, basically, like a soul, like a fundamental unity, or is
Okay, I see
everything
what you're saying.
more in flux, more process, arising and passing away, and space is more fundamental. And so I think I don't actually know like how I would go about determining like what is fundamental. I think both people like both sides are like really smart. Um, and I do think there is category qualitatively, that's where I would go. And I would completely agree. It's like, I think a experience of emptiness and void, which I find immensely peaceful. Like I just love to sit outside and look at the sky and meditate on arising and passing away. And I feel this immense peace. And I love it. And then, there's like devotional practices in the field in the tradition of bhakti. And I'm sorry, my Sanskrit is not that great, but it's
You're
that
good.
means service. And you can have these really loving, warm experiences of being connected, like through helping people. Like if you go and help people and then you meditate on God, or you meditate on, it's usually Krishna or Ram in the Hindu tradition, that you like devote yourself and you go to a soup kitchen or something, or you go sing, or you do something like that. And that's a completely different, profound experience. And I would put that more in unity, like we are all one. So I choose to help you. Um, yeah. And so I think the insight there is that there are qualitatively different types of spiritual or meditation type practices have different results. And like, we need to determine what the meaning of that is.
Very interesting. I really want to hit on that last one.
Yeah.
What you were saying. Okay, so you said, so let me make sure that I'm getting this right. So you said that there's a type of practice that is in Hinduism where people would actually, well, the same, you can sort of think of it like the same sort of feeling that you get from when you actually help somebody, that warm feeling. You can sit and meditate on
Yeah.
that warm feeling and actually
Exactly.
get that.
Yeah.
Okay. Now that we're getting into some good questions here. Okay.
Yeah.
So I was looking at chakras, like the seven
Hmm.
chakras and Kundalini energy and Kundalini yoga and all these other things, right? So the chakras, right? Um, and maybe there's a separation, and I got a question about that as well, and we can get to that in a second.
Okay.
Let's say with the chakras, right? So you say something like the heart chakra. What I end up
Mm.
hearing is that in order to unlock your heart chakra, you would sit and like meditate on the thing that might have of like trying to feel um getting rid of all the things that you're resentful over and different things like that. That might be one
Yeah.
chakra that you might be getting over. And then maybe another one, if you're like embarrassed about something, you sit and
Mm.
like try to uh, meditate on that, the thing that you're embarrassed about, and you can get over that and unlock another chakra.
Yeah.
And is this sort of like the same sort of like ecology of practices that you're talking about with the thing in Hinduism?
I
Is this
think so.
something? Is there? Do you see do you see any correlation between what I'm talking about and like what you're talking about?
Yeah. I think there's a correlation. I think it's complicated with the chakras because they come through the tradition of, um, chakras really come through the tradition of like Britain when they were in India,
Really?
and then they came, people got super fascinated with like what's called the perennial tradition and like occultism and hermeticism and like what's her name, Blavatsky, Theosophy, Aleister Crowley, um, all this stuff came, and then it came through the 60s and like Ram Dass. And so it's like a system that is loosely, connected to some Hindu traditions, but there's so many energy systems. And for whatever reason, that just was big in Victorian England. And so I think the chakras are better understood as more of a like a new age spiritual type thing than a Hindu thing.
Okay.
That kind of
Interesting.
that it grounded in its credibility in Hinduism. But I really think it's more of a modern invention. Um, there's a good one, The True Story. There's a book or a blog called Tantra Illuminated. And I forget that guy's name. He's a scholar of Hinduism and Tantra. And he wrote The Real Story on the Chakras. And that's a good read for people.
Mhm.
Um, so, yeah, because there's this like idea that people kind of made up their own spiritual systems, and then they kind of lied and referenced like ancient traditions as a kind of way to give it credibility. Which, by the
Interesting.
way, doesn't mean like the practices you're suggesting sound super powerful. And if they work for me, I don't care if they're grounded. Like I'm kind of a shameless pragmatist and an American, like things that work. I believe belief is a technology.
Hmm.
And, you know,
Interesting.
but I do also like want to be precise and share. Yeah, I think history is important. And if we're going to like map these things out, I think I personally conceptualize chakra work as more a kind of Anglo American New Age kind of comparative project, bringing together multiple systems into one perennial kind of New Age philosophy. It's kind of how I see it.
Interesting. Okay.
But yeah, so I mean, your original question was, do I see chakras in the ecology of practice that I'm talking about? Um, yeah,
Okay.
I think that's fair.
Let me ask you another thing. And I know these might seem a little bit of random, but
I like it. I think we're having a good
just
conversation.
yeah, we're having a great conversation, so why not? Okay. Okay, so I hear a lot of people talk about Kundalini yoga
Mm-hmm.
and Kundalini energy.
Mm-hmm.
I I sort of kind of understand it. It when anybody brings up like the chakra system, I always hear they always also bring up like Kundalini energy and Kundalini yoga in the same like breath.
Yeah.
Are they like, or is there any correlation with these two, or they're completely different? Is it like,
Between Kundalini and the chakras?
yeah, and
Well,
maybe
we could talk about it. I think there's a correlation in this sense. Like I think the chakras are a worldview or a tool that are trying to help systematize and organize an idea, which an idea that is across different traditions. So we could talk about prana, we could talk about chi, we could talk about kundalini energy. We could talk about in the Western tradition, orgone, or what's that guy's name? Alain Vital, um, Bergson. Um, so this idea, it's called vitalism, that there's a life force energy that animates things, right? And that through various techniques and ideas, you can connect with that somehow. And like Reiki is like just visualize a symbol and like connect with it. And then like weird things happen. Or some people describe odd, interesting things, sometimes healing things. And like that's something we need to theorize at least and understand. Um, Whether it's placebo or whether there is something there that's hard to measure for some reason. That's a really so I find it fascinating. Just to mention, so I do think, and chakras are a way are like a apparatus, a conceptual apparatus to say like, okay, there's blocks in the kundalini. The reason that it's not just flowing freely through you is there's some kind of physical, psychological, or spiritual block. And if you do this structured system, you can remove your blocks.
Mhm.
And this guy in the Tantra Illuminated blog points out that there's many different systems that conceptualize this, and some with 3 chakras, some with like hundreds. So yeah, and then I'll just make a point just because we started with non-duality. I think this is interesting.
Mhm.
So with like the direct path teachings, they usually bypass Kundalini and not necessarily, or this idea of focusing on energy. And it's not because,
When you say direct path, could you clarify a little bit?
yeah, direct path is just like go to this. It's a form of practice that is like, what is the fundamental insight, which is you are everything, consciousness and awareness makes up everything. And so ask the question like, who am I? And rest in that awareness again and again, like
Mhm. Okay.
embody the awareness that you're consciousness. This is called the direct path. Now, they might say that Kundalini is real, or they might say that Kundalini isn't real, but they would, I think, often are just like, let's not focus on it. Let's just focus on what's fundamental. Like Kundalini is just something, it's just something in the relative world. But then if you've experienced Kundalini awakenings and energy, I mean, I think it's pretty
It feels
interesting.
real. Yeah, it
Yeah.
feels real. Okay, interesting.
Yeah. So that's whether or not you want to explore that realm, I think, is a question on what your goals are with the meditation practice, you know. So for
Interesting.
me, like, as I call myself an ethical hedonist.
Ethical hate. I think I heard you talk about this before. I really want to hear this. This
Yeah,
is going to
I
be interesting.
consider myself an ethical hedonist, which means that I am unsure um, of what's happening. You know, I'm unsure. Like, I like to work on the Gnostic agnostic dimension instead of the theism atheism. Like, I really like to think about experience and experiential knowledge. And so I've experienced very interesting things, but I don't have very firm, like, theistic or atheistic beliefs about them. I kind
Let
of
me ask
bracket.
you, before we even go any
Yeah.
further, I want to make sure I understand this correctly. What would you say would be the difference between Gnostic, agnostic versus something like theism versus
Mhm.
non-theism? What
So
would be what is the fundamental difference?
so theism and atheism are about belief. So a theist says, what's the Apostles' Creed? I believe in one God. I can't. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I forget the Apostles' Creed. But you believe that there's God is three, that Christ went to hell. You have this belief set. And atheism's like, I don't believe that. That's ridiculous.
You don't
Um,
believe in nothing.
yeah, no, I don't believe in that. Gnostic is actually a term that means experiential knowledge. So, like, I have had an experience. I've had an experience of oneness. I've had an experience of Kundalini rising. I have seen a vision of an angel. I've seen this vision. Like, I've had very interesting dreams and visions, and I recognize them. They're interesting, um, but I don't necessarily extrapolate beliefs from them. Like, okay, I've seen an interesting vision of Jesus, and then I've experienced healing in my life and peace. Therefore, I believe in the Apostles' Creed. I wouldn't necessarily make that leap. I would be like, nice, cool, that's exciting. Can I repeat that? Can I do that again? um,
Interesting.
yeah, so I like to, just from a matter of personal preference, I like to have flexible beliefs and iterate and update them based on evidence. So I try to hold my beliefs lightly, and I try to experience as much as possible,
Mhm.
which I think is important to the ethical hedonist worldview, because since I don't have a strong belief in the afterlife, um, either way, I think it's important to experience. I want to experience new and interesting things and generally feel good. Um, but I feel not only good, but feel deeply and intensely and a variety of things. So I like affirm experience seeking, which makes me a horrible Buddhist. That's why I'm not a Buddhist, because they say don't experience anything, because that's going to lead to suffering. I would do the
Mhm.
opposite. I would experience as much as
Everything.
possible with the knowledge that it's going to be unsatisfactory. Like, it's a loop. It's like feel good, feel bad. Like, we're stuck in that loop. Um, but then I think I don't want to just be necessarily egoist and selfish. Like, I like other people and other beings.
Mhm.
So I want to do that hedonism in such a way that other beings can also feel good. I don't want to just consume all the resources and, like, not think about the future. And so that's why I call it like an ethical hedonism. Um, yeah.
That's interesting. Okay. So I have I have like three questions here.
Mhm.
I'll ask one
Yeah.
first.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm still I'm still missing the link between like the duality duality
Hmm.
the duality between Gnostic and agnostic. I'm still
Okay.
missing what would I'm still not fully conceptualizing the difference.
Yeah.
Like
So let's go
and
back.
obviously there's a difference because like is agnostic, gnostic,
Mhm.
obviously, but I'm failing to understand it. So
So let's use a concept we talked about earlier about no self. Okay.
mhm,
And so this is an experience. It's like a thing that is experiential knowledge that myself is a loop, a linguistic loop. I feel it like right here, and that's all it is. And then that experientially for me was experience with, like, a release, like an emotional release, and a big inflection of peace. And then I read in certain Vipassana texts that people have similar experiences, and I'm like, oh, I experienced something like that. I get what they're talking about. So that would be a Gnostic experience. Like I experienced no self. Um, and
Okay,
someone
I
who's
see.
like, what are you talking about? Like, I never experienced something like that. They wouldn't necessarily say that's not real. I don't believe that's possible, but they would say I'm agnostic about it. Because and maybe I want to try, like, maybe let me try some of these meditation experiments to see if it works for me. Or maybe they are like, that doesn't sound nice to me, so I'm not going to do it. But if you say a priori, like no self is impossible because everyone has a soul,
Hmm.
then that would make you a theist of some sort. But if you're like,
Interesting.
well, I don't know if that makes sense to me, and I haven't experienced anything like that, that would make you more agnostic.
I never looked at it that way. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Interesting.
At
Okay.
least in
The
my
second,
worldview.
okay, interesting. Let me ask you about the ethics of it. So
Yeah,
you said you're
nice.
an ethical
Mm-hmm.
hedonist. So I would assume that, well, you would one critique usually of like hedonism is that you're sacrificing the long term for a short term gain.
Yeah,
What do you make of that? Do you think with your ethics, do you think that there's a benefit of doing that? There's not a benefit of doing that?
yeah.
Is it
No,
really
no,
a
no.
long term gain?
That I accept that critique. I think that's a strong critique. And that, like, so my background, exploring a lot of this is coming in addiction recovery. So I'm a therapist. I like helping people get over addictions. And that's like one of my main points is like a lot of addiction therapists and drug and alcohol counselors are coming out of a philosophy of temperance, which is that we need to be less hedonistic, and hedonism got you in this mess trying to feel good. I kind of I don't project this onto people, but how I think about it is like, so let's say one of my favorite cases was someone doing cocaine and gambling
Mhm.
and spent over $150,000 on treatment, 5 or 6 stays. Came to my little group. I have a group that's free. We just a community group. And he had
Mhm.
a couple big breakthroughs, just like 4 of us sitting in a room for free. Had a couple big breakthroughs because we were just talking about, and he's been, last time I checked was like 3 months ago, been in recovery for like 4 years, and
Mhm.
doing well.
That's good.
Yeah, it's great. His breakthrough was like, I am not a sober person. Like I like he does cocaine and gambles. Like he likes the thrill. He likes the thrill of life. And so our breakthrough with him was like, how can I have more thrill for longer? Like cocaine and gambling are like short fuses. It's actually like if you live a life where you can have like long-term thrill, sustainable thrill, that's actually what he like would rather go skydiving, and like have enough money to
Nice.
continue to do fun stuff because he was just losing all his money and then living a horrible existence in between these like short bursts. And so I think like, yeah, sustainable hedonism is maybe a better word for it. Like
Mhm.
sustainability and long-term thinking in the service of feeling better and experiencing more as opposed to in the service of just some random value, um, which, that God likes it or something. Yeah. So I do accept that critique, and I try to integrate it into my worldview.
Interesting. So another way to say it is that you're trying to figure out, and I heard you talk a little bit about the flow state in
Mm-hmm.
one of your I think it was you had a woman who was talking about non-duality on your
And
show
I
once.
probably, yeah,
And you were talking a little bit about the flow state. So it's in other words to think of it is like how can you get the guy into the flow state in a way that's actually not like super destructive towards his own well-being for that
yeah.
matter. Um
And his families and the people he cares about, which, yeah, I tend to, with clients, just say like, what kind of values do you have? What do you want in life? And like, how can I help you think clearly and get more of what you want in a safe way for the people that you care about and yourself, whoever that is. And like this guy cared about himself and his family. And yeah, so he can like, you know, have what he wants, which is like some thrill, which fine, that's nothing wrong with that. But do it in a way that you can keep doing it and balance these other priorities you have about like taking care of your kid and, you know, having peace with your wife, that kind of thing.
Hmm. Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. So let's go. I don't know how much time, more
Let's
time you
see,
have left.
maybe go like 20, 30 more minutes. You cool with that?
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
Hopefully I have enough things to say for 30 minutes.
Yeah, we'll just go. We'll
Okay.
vibe out for a little longer.
Cool. Okay. Let me ask you, let me ask you about this. You're like, I assume that you're like into a whole bunch of integral stuff. How did you get into it? What got you into it?
That's a good
So,
question. How did I get into integral stuff? I got into Carl Jung first. That's kind of like a big reference point for me. And then a lot of people just cite Ken Wilber. Um, and I think like maybe you can tell from how I'm talking, like I like to put things in frameworks, like like I was doing the naturalism, supernaturalism. And I think, I'm a systematizing thinker, so I'm attracted to other systematizing thinkers. And, in our society, our culture right now, like Ken Wilber's, one of the most well referenced, and a lot of people have gotten a lot out of his work. So I can't remember the first reference I saw of his, but um, yeah, I think it was in some way related to some Jungian psychology. And I don't actually read a ton of Wilbur. Um, I do like the guy you mentioned. Oh crap, his name just flew out of my mind though. Another stage thinker. He's got levels.
oh, Susan Corgoiner, John Gibser,
Gebser. Gebser.
Gibser. I think Gibser is spiral dynamics. I think Susan is ego developmental models.
Mhm.
I think
I
it's
looked into
one of
him.
the.
I'm actually really into a guy named Dave Snowden.
Oh yeah, Dave Snowden. Yeah,
Yeah,
oh my
he
goodness.
comes at integral
Yeah.
pretty hard, and
Uh,
I like him because I think the way I think about development is a bit more ecological. Like I think the risk of hierarchical models is my worry about hierarchical models is that it's a projection of the brain, is that people are mapping their own brain because the brain works in a top down. There's a bottom up processing with the brain too, but we naturally, I think the parts of the default, like we like to make hierarchies and just in like what we're motivated to do. So like you could be doing a lot of different things tonight, but for some reason, this conversation, we both were motivated to do it. So there's a natural hierarchy of motivation. Like I,
mhm,
could be taking a shower. I could be writing an essay. I could be going out to dance, but I want to have a conversation about non-duality. And
mhm.
to just live and function and make decisions, there has to be a hierarchical model, decision-making model. And so I think I get worried and somewhat skeptical of hierarchical measures of development just because I worry that they might be projections of the brain. Um, and like I said, this is the beautiful, irrational, romantic aspect of philosophy and science is that we're, we're trying to do something that might be impossible, to theorize outside of a brain, an inherently limited processing thing. We're trying to transcend it. It's such a cool project. Um,
Okay.
but yeah, those are some thoughts. I do need to engage with Wilbur more. I want to, but I've been more into Gebser and Snowden.
Okay. So much I want to talk.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. There's so many questions I have.
Okay.
Okay. So you said Dave Snowden. If
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about the same, is so there might be different Dave Snowdens. If we're talking about the same Dave Snowden, is this the same guy that came up with the
Yeah.
Cinefin model? Okay.
Cynefin is called.
Oh,
It's
Kinevin
Welsh.
framework.
Yeah, it's Welsh.
Okay. Interesting. What is the framework that you're like, there's another framework. I'm assuming he came up with another framework that you're like mentioning.
Well, it's complex. It's more. It's there's a couple frameworks in Dave Snowden, but Dave Snowden is interested in organizational development too. So like
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Snowden is, or excuse me, um, Wilbur is looking at consciousness, and comparative
Yes.
religion, and Snowden's looking at like how to run a successful organization. So there's some inherent tension. I think I'm attracted to Snowden for that reason, because like I have goals around like ending overdoses, and like I have very pragmatic goals that I care about. So like Snowden is a bit more appealing to me because he's like, oh, let's like run an organization. So I have biases that attract me to him more. But I think the grounding, like he's coming out of a complex adaptive systems
Mhm.
model. And that's interesting because we're like nodes in that, right? Like, so he, like group mind, it's like bottom up emergent knowledge. And so he talks
Mhm.
about like maths sensing networks. And so, like, a way he would I think, approach philosophy is less about like one smart genius man, like, and ask like 100,000 people and like see what the patterns are. And he'd like look at, oh, okay, like there's some people think like this, and that's intriguing. So I think there's just a fundamental like difference in how they think. Um, and I think both are very valid. I try to incorporate both. But I've just been very attracted to Snowden recently because of that organizational point. And I think I'm a bit more naturally a top down thinker. And so I'm trying to expose myself to someone with a different approach to kind of strengthen my own thinking and challenge myself. Yeah.
Okay, that's
But
super
yeah, we're
interesting.
talking about the same people. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, let me ask you. So I definitely want you, whatever talk. I only know of Dave from his the Cinefin. Is that how you say it? The
Kinevin.
Cinefin model. Kenevin,
Yeah.
Kenevin. I keep saying
That's Welsh.
something.
It's very hard to say.
Yeah, Kenevin framework. Which I find crazy interesting because of
Yeah.
a whole bunch of different reasons. Whatever other stuff that you have on him when you're talking about these different things, like send them to me because I'm like super
Yeah.
interested in
Let's
hearing
do it. Just read them and
more.
then we'll skip back on and talk about it. Have you looked into his critique of integral?
I've heard like I briefly he was on Rebel Wisdom
Uh
with
huh.
it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I briefly heard about it, but I didn't like it was like passively. I was more
Hmm.
interested in the Cynefin framework, but
Cool.
uh
Yeah. I think you'll
but I
like
got to
it
hear it
with
again.
your background too. Cause I don't know what kind of, with the software stuff, it's completely a tangent, but like he's like really influenced like agile and different project management solutions. And he got some really interesting ideas on that. But they're coming out of this like deeply interesting, philosophically grounded thing. I just like how it has very practical, like, to me that's a good measure. Like, to go to the Christian tradition, there's a debate of works, acts, or deeds, or like beliefs. It's like I'm just like, I think Jesus, our spiritual figure, would appreciate someone out there on the streets helping people than someone real pious in the library. I think that's just, I think spirituality and philosophical insight, I want it to have an impact on the natural world. Um, like I would think that deeper knowledge would help in some way, but that's a bias, and that's cultural bias, and that's a personality bias potentially. So I don't want to say that it has. When it comes to philosophy, it's like pragmatism is a very distinct branch of philosophy, and it
Mhm.
has many critiques. And just because something's useful doesn't mean it's true.
Very true.
Yeah, something
That's
can be
very true.
useful. Yeah, and be there's some ignorance involved in it, and sometimes that can mystify. Actually, that can, thinking something is true just because it's useful can take me in the wrong direction. So I want to call myself out for that, but yeah, but that's cool, man. I'd love to hear what you think of Kinevin. We can do a deep dive into it and see how it um, relates to integral.
Interesting. So let me just highlight. I don't really see a correlation between Kinevin framework and integral.
Mhm.
Okay, so really what got me really interested in the Kinevin framework was this whole, I don't know if you ever heard of it, but there was a whole bunch of people talking about game B.
Mhm.
So and Dave Snowden, he made a differentiation between like a complicated system versus a complex system, which I
Yeah.
found really interesting, right? Like you can think of one way to think of a complicated system. Complicated is in pretty much anything that you can take apart and then put back together again. It's pretty much a complicated system. So this iPhone, I can take it apart, put it back together again. A microphone, I can take it apart, put it back together again. This
Yeah.
microphone doesn't heal itself. A street doesn't heal itself, etc.
Yeah.
A complex system is sort of like a human being, right? Where like a human being heals itself, a forest ecosystem heals itself, right? Like I can cut down a whole bunch of trees, but the trees like repair them, grow back, um, etc. And there was a whole bunch of folks talking about like game B, which is a whole nother is something I've been researching for like I don't know the past like 6 months, like reading a whole bunch of books
That's
on.
cool.
Um, which is another conversation for another time. But
Yeah.
yeah, so but that's what actually got me into the Kinevin framework. It wasn't really integral. Integral came from it just a whole I was just watching Rebel Wisdom and Ken Woodward showed up and like
Oh
I
yeah.
just listened to
Gotcha.
him. Uh, and then it was like quite interesting because he had I was trying to understand postmodernism at the time because
Mhm.
it's kind of hard to like understand it, etc. at the time. But then you had like the spiral dynamics model and where it had like, you know, you had orange, which was rational, and you had green, which was like the postmodernist thing. And like I can start to see like the philosophical differences between the two. So yeah, that was sort of like how I got into it.
Gotcha.
This was in high school, I think. So not too long ago. So
Yeah, that point about the complicated and complex really strikes me. I find that to be so interesting. I kind of want to think about how that could apply to non-duality, maybe, because I think like when I think of complex a difference, I love how you said it. All I would add to complex is like two things. And it's shocking how this insight from Knevin has not been integrated into more like scientific discourse, especially around psychology and economics, um, which is simple. It's just like things that change when you observe them or things that learn. That's hard to study. Like, how do we study
mm,
that in the same way we study natural sciences, which don't do that? They don't behave. It's so much easier to study something that doesn't change when you observe it and doesn't learn. So like that's a fundamental epistemological issue with studying with naturalism, like studying human social systems and psychology is like if you look at me, if I go to therapy, I'm not the same being. Like I learn going through it. So
mhm.
it's really hard to measure and I think the that insight is really fundamental and really interesting and I think a lot of people don't when thinking about methodologies and like how to look at and that might be like a similar thing with integral actually that's just like the perspective like how you look at things really changes like if like from the integral it's talking about the way your mind works like the mindset or like the yeah the tools you're the cognitive tools you're bringing to bear on a situation
Mhm.
really that observation changes the thing you're looking at in some like interesting weird way um and
And so
that
let me make sure, but let me just
yeah
make sure I'm on the right way. So you're basically saying like the if I'm getting it right, you're basically saying the worldview that you hold at the given time dictates the thing that you like dictates the thing that you're looking at. Am I somewhere in
yeah
the
I
realm of what
pro-
you're saying?
yeah you're in the realm I would personally say like my current philosophical worldview is it helps shape and so I would posit that there is like a kind of material substance to you um but then how I look at you and how my consciousness projects things onto you it prevents me from seeing it So that's why I call it create critical realism or creative critical realism. It's like I'm a realist in some sense, but I'm critical. Like I think my culture, my language, my ego development, if we want to bring that language in, shapes a lot how I'm viewing you. And if I go to a stage, if it's outside and cold and dark and I haven't got a lot of sleep and, I'm in a certain neighborhood, you know, I might, I might look at someone a different way. I might be like, that's a killer. I need to get the fuck out of here.
To a
Whereas I'm
point.
sitting here, I'm comfortable, I'm warm. I know you, um, I'm not going to look at you that way. And so I just think we naturally, and it was the same person, like assuming that was you who I was walking around in the streets with, it's the same person, same reality. But and yet like my perception is different. It's kind of a basic point, but I think it's you know, it's something we have to contend with if we're making truth claims about reality. If we're trying to do
Very,
philosophy, if we're trying to, I mean, we have to account for that somehow.
very true. Very true. Oh, man, totally has agreements with that. That's actually a great insight. I
Yeah.
think if you look at, I mean, to go a little bit more into it, if you look at and I think this is with the, let me think of it, the inner was it uh no, outer, I think it was outer subjective. So
Mm,
basically the culture, how
yeah.
culture actually encapsulates you, right? So all the language that I'm speaking, all the worldviews I'm having, the idea of science, the idea of like any of this stuff, none of this stuff is actually my ideas. This is actually coming from culture. That's
Hmm.
actually I think that's actually a profound insight.
Yeah. I agree.
That a lot of people actually would just like run over.
It's
So
like a download. It's an apparatus, which is a resource and also is, you might like this. I think of it as technical debt. There's technical debt. We have technical debt in our development. So this is a metaphor I just did a video on this. It's a metaphor I use all the time in psychology, which is that in development, you grow up in a difficult environment. So you have to pick up certain habits, certain survival mechanisms like, okay, don't have high self-esteem, have low self-esteem because that'll keep you from getting yelled at or hit, you know? And so you pick up, and that's actually a good move because it keeps you safe. But then you get into the workplace and you can't speak up and you're not getting promoted. And it's not the same, you're not getting hit or yelled at anymore. And so you have this code essentially that you've in, picked up, and then you have to go back and like refactor it. And that's painful and costly, just like how a startup starts with like Google Sheets and all this crappy technology because they can't afford anything, like a bunch
and
of
you gotta
Zapier,
refactor it.
you got to refactor it. And so I think it's a powerful metaphor for, and I think we could go deeper than that in culture. Like people are running around killing each other and shit, and doing all, and so people pick up these like harsh moral codes, which are like we need to like control our animal impulses because they're like too much, and so we pick up this like okay, we're going to be stoning you if you mess up. We're going to be like really coming at you hard, and I think it's kind of, I see it as faulty. That might be a reductive metaphor, but it helps me think of some of this insight that, but then we also have like, look at how many, I think it's also positive, having this code like from Western philosophy and Buddhism. Like I'm able to quickly download these deep insights because people, wrote books and just downloaded their consciousness and into these things. So I think there's a technical debt level, but there's also like we've got a lot of resources. So I'm appreciative and grateful for people.
Okay, let me add on this because I think what you're saying is so profound. So
Okay.
let me put it this way. Um, so you could say sort of that conditioning, right? So the conditioning for a person to act some sort of way, given way, you might actually have an entire society that is like that. So like you might get some sort of like warring tribe that's trying to go and kill the other tribe, and then everybody's conditioned, and the one that actually won the evolutionary won through evolution is actually the warring tribe.
Yeah.
But then if you try to go and study what is actually like humans, what is actually um, things that are adaptive towards humans, right? It's actually kind of difficult because you have the warring tribe, and then there might have been something that has came up through the evolutionary process, but actually got killed from
Hmm.
the other tribe.
Hmm.
I'll give you an example. So there's a I don't know if you ever heard of it. It was called, I think it's called Sex at Dawn, right? So there was this
I read
idea
that.
between, interesting. So there's a bunch of people talking about like, is humans more conditioned for monogamy or is it polyamorous, right?
Hmm.
Um, and it's actually quite difficult. They have some studies on this, but it's actually, if you think of it, it's actually kind of difficult to like actually study this because the thing that won through the evolutionary process is actually monogamy. But then you can try to find societies over time that was like conditioned from their own like social system or whatever, maybe from that given time where they became polyamorous, right? So there was like a tribe maybe 10, maybe 5,000 years ago that might have like impregnated every single woman. And they didn't really care about who was the dad or whatever, because everybody, the idea was that um, that that uh, 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 the idea was that if I'm getting it right, uh, what actually makes the baby strong was the sperm that came out from all the other guys, right?
Sure.
So, and you had a whole social system in relation to that, right? In order to, everybody was like in Dunbar number situations. So there was all under 150 people, everybody knew each other, et cetera, right? It wasn't like a random civilization of 100,000 people, a million
Yeah.
people all around worldwide. Um, loop. That was a little tangent, but I
Interesting
think it was a
stuff.
little related.
Yeah. Yeah. Glad you're connecting with some of the ideas. Yeah. What do you think? Any kind of, it's been a pretty good, maybe I'll ask you, how would you kind of summarize the territory we've been on?
Sorry. So we talked about non-duality. We talked about AI. We
Yeah.
talked about integral and spiral dynamics. We talked about
Can Evan.
uh Kinevin framework. We talked about a whole bunch. Um, I'm definitely going to rewatch. If you will you upload this
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
YouTube?
This will
And
be
it's
on
live.
YouTube. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna definitely rewatch it. To see because there's a lot of good points that you made at the beginning. Well,
Cool.
actually throughout the entire thing, but I want to go back.
Yeah. Yeah. Rewatch it and let me know. We can do it again too. Do maybe a recurring thing. Cause I like this format a lot. Let me just show you this one thing though. Hold up. Let me share it. See if the audience too. If the audience likes this, and not that it matters. What matters is if we like it. But I do care about the audience. You know. Wait, this isn't what I want. Hold up. Okay. Let's see how we're doing. I haven't been looking at the chat. Legends. Hello. We got some chatters, but
There we go.
uh, um, I put together this table that I can send you. I'd love to hear your thoughts based on this. So again, I think what we're doing here is like theory and praxis, right? We're really looking at the theory, and I'm trying to ground some experiential things that have happened to me in a kind of worldview, just because I find it fun. I like thinking and discussing. Um, and so the way I'm looking at the three major philosophical views that I've found in my studies of philosophy. You can look at the history of Western philosophy by Bertrand Russell, um, who maps all this out. Also, Passion of the Western Mind by Richard Tarnas does a good job of mapping this out. And I think some of the integral folks map this stuff out, but I'd be interested if people disagree with me. But it's two dimensions on this table: the worldview, naturalism, supernaturalism, and creative anti-realism. And then my thing I'm building called creative critical realism. Um, and then you've got metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, which are three kind of sets of questions in philosophy. You know, uh, what is, you know, how do we know it, and what should we do about
Hmm.
it, basically.
Hmm.
And my ethics, of course, is ethical hedonism. We talked a little bit about that, but I think the big question is epistemology. Like that is, I think, like, how do we justify our truth claims? Um,
Mhm.
with a so like how can I go from I had this experience of no self or this experience of oneness to the concept that no self is fundamental or something like that. That's, I think, work that needs to be philosophical. Like, I think the experiential work is very, very important. And, but I think some of the religions and spirituality, my critique of them is I think there's a bit of a leap from experience to theism that I think it needs more philosophical. I think more discussions like this are important because, yeah, I mean, we're in a position where we have these experiences and then I think people become very susceptible, to people to different people who have like very rigid belief systems. Like since you had this experience, it means this and will always mean this. I think it's a little boring, and it can be dangerous if you look at all these cult shows that pop up. It can be dangerous, but I think it's more so just boring. Like it's just more fun to be in a spirit of inquiry and talk about this stuff. So yeah, I appreciate you doing it, and I'm down to do it again. And if folks on the YouTube want more of it, let us know some topics. You got any final thoughts?
Oh yeah. It was great talking to you. And
Yeah,
definitely send me this Google Doc. I want to like read over it, and I can actually give you like a really good
yeah. Give
good
me some comments. Let me send this to you right now. I'll find your email. I got your email on my thing, but I'll put it in the. I'll make it for people on the YouTube. If you made it this far, shout out to you. We've been talking for a while.
yeah, an
Uh,
hour and a half.
but I'll put
But it
it
was
in
good talk.
the yeah, I'll put it in the description too. So if people want to access it, and I'll try to maybe I'll run this through AI transcript and try to get um, the sources we mentioned, so you can have a little glossary.
That'd be awesome. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
One thing I want to talk about the next
yeah,
time is a little bit about Coral Young. I know that
yeah.
you're you're super into him and everything. I'm like the most I have done yet is just like listen to a whole bunch of YouTube videos about like anima, animus, and
Mm-hmm.
archetypes and different things. But there's a lot of questions that I have about him for the next time. So yeah, that's definitely one thing.
We could do
And
a
yeah,
young we could do a young stream. That'd be cool.
that'll be interesting. That'll be interesting for sure.